We are now in Parsha Shelach. Very, very fascinating Parsha. And we're going to talk about it from an interesting perspective, from the perspective of free choice. Okay, now there's a fundamental concept in the Torah that we are given free will, that we can be righteous or wicked, and it's actually written in the Torah, "Behold, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil." And what that means is that the choice is up to each person. So the Creator doesn't force people to do good or bad. The Creator does want us to do good and choose life, but everything is left to our own choice. And we're given the power to control our conduct and act according to our own initiative. And this is different than for any other form of life, where animals, for example, have their instincts and they do what they do that works for them, but there's no free choice in a real way where they can think and consider and do. Now, using free choice is essential to our divine service. And we have the option to carry out God's will or, heaven forbid, to ignore it. So our challenge is to choose life, which means living our lives as God desires. Now, there are two types of positive choice that are expected of us. The first one is doing the mitzvah, doing the commandments of the Torah. And these are commandments, these are multifaceted actions which we are obligated to do, that God has told us, do this, and others that God is saying, do not do this. And sometimes, so we have a clear vision of what are the things for us to do and what are not for us to do. Now, sometimes this is difficult for people because what God wants them to do or what God does not want them to do is not comfortable for their natural tendencies. So there is a certain amount of work that people have to do, but it's our power of choice that enables us to control and negate any inner obstacles that could get in the way of the fulfillment of God. So if we know that this is something God does not want us to do, even though our nature might be drawn toward that, if there's something God does not want to do, we are able to work with that in our own natures to overcome what we feel like doing and get to the place where we know this is what God actually does want. But you can see that we have to work with our free will to choose to want what God wants. The second one, in other words, the first one was God is telling us what he would like us to do. The second way is that we need to mold our character to conform to God's will, even when there's no specifically given commandment to do that. So that means that how can I know what to do if there's nothing specifically telling me how to act? Because obviously there are many, many times that we're involved in mitzvah. We're living in mitzvah. Eat a meal, it has to be kosher, we say a blessing. There's a lot that's prescribed from God. But most of the time that we're in the world is not specific. And this is called, these areas are called reshut, which means what is permitted. It's in the area of what we could do. But in these situations, we're not told what we have to do or what we can't do. But nevertheless, there is a godly way of conduct that is appropriate for these activities. So when we're learning Torah, we're being told what we can do and must do, what we can't do and shouldn't do. But then there's a whole area in between that's permissible to us. So, for example, the person says they're really working on eating in a healthy way because it's very important to keep health. That's very important in our service of God. And then somebody offers you exactly the kind of cake that you want. And that's my nature. That is it. If I would be describing the cake that I would like, that is the one. And a person can say, it's kosher, I could have a little bit. Person could say, it's not kosher, I can't have any of it. But then there's the level of, I could have it. And that's where the person has to work on themselves to say, can I have a little bit? Does that work for me? Or is that something that becomes a little addictive? In which case, maybe I should choose not to have any. Because if it's going to be not supportive of my health and not supportive of the kind of action that I should be taking, then that is not what I want to do. In other words, working on what we consider to be an appropriate way of action that does fit in with God wants. But for this, the initiative is ours. And we need to recognize God's will and then shape our characters accordingly. That's not always so easy because it means changing our habits. Then it means changing our nature. And this is a good thing because there is a lower nature and a higher nature. A nature that is, there are different ways to speak about it. On the inside, we have our godly soul. And the godly soul wants only what is good and connected to God. Then we also have our animal soul nature, which gets things accomplished that is good for us. But our inner natural soul, we see, for example, that children can be very rude to their parents and really, really not nice at all. And that's natural. You didn't give it to me. I wanted. Why did you not give it to me? And that's a very natural thing. But somehow through an education process, sometimes an education process for the parents as well, there needs to be a way that we teach the children that that's not the way to do it. That you can say, something's bothering me, I'm upset, I was really looking forward to it, and I really wanted it. Could I have a little piece of it? Something that, or can we go, like you said, we could go even for a little while. In other words, the children have to learn how to express what is important for them, what they're asking for, in a better way. And this brings people, which is all of our inner children, brings us to a more mature, developed, what can be called second nature, which is a developed nature that is more in connection with what God wants and with our true potential. And the Rambam speaks about the character traits that need to be blended in good ways. It said you could be smart or foolish, and there are many other qualities, but we see that it's not always black and white, because intellect is good, very good, but we also need heart. It needs to be blended. And there's an expression for foolishness, which is shtut. And it says that a lot of the times when people do things that are not right, it's because they get themselves into this foolishness. Like they say, it's not going to make a difference, so who cares? When it does make a difference. Then there's something else called shtut de kedusha, where you have like a holy folly or a holy foolishness. And that can be, there's a story in the Talmud about a person who was greatly rewarded. You know, he had a heavenly connection because he would get in front of the bride and the groom when they were getting married and just do all kinds of silly, funny things just to make them happy. You know, it's a big day, and in case they were nervous, he would just woohoo and, you know, just make them happy. And that is a shtut de kedusha. That's also a foolishness, but it's a holy foolishness. Mm-hmm. So we have to know, when is this really for the good and it's meaningful? We're not meant to be humorless people. We have to have the right kind of humor. So what's the right kind of humor? when you're laughing from a higher place and you get it, and you laugh with people for good things. What's a lower sense of humor? Not to laugh at somebody who slipped on a banana peel, God forbid. That we don't laugh at somebody, laugh with somebody. So all this takes a development in our natures to work with. So this is where we have to know what to get rid of and what to develop in terms of what we could do. And when we take what we learn from the Torah and we ascertain what God wants from us and how God wants us to be, then we need to also consider who we want to be and make that a reality. So sometimes we could say, what I just did wasn't so good. I don't want to be that kind of person. Or I see what she did, and I realize I like that. I would like to be that kind of person. So, for example, a person who says thank you to someone who serves them opens the door for them or serves them someplace. It's saying thank you. It's not a law. It's not a halacha that you should say thank you. Although there are, in Pirkei Avot, there are discussions and implications about how to behave. But when we say, I want to be that kind of person, that when somebody does something nice for me, that I say thank you. I want to be that kind of person. I don't want to be the kind of person that just takes and doesn't care about the other person. So then we have to work on that. We have to work on that to make us part of who we are. And that will affect how we do the things that we could do when it's reshut, when it's in our ability to do it, but we don't have to do it. The Mishnah says, make his will your will, so that he may fulfill your will as though it were his will. Set aside your will because of his will, so that he may set aside the will of others before your will. So what does this mean? Setting aside your will because of his will refers to the challenge of letting go of your own desires to obey God's commandments. So that means something really special is happening on a Friday afternoon, and you know that there's going to be traffic from there, and Friday is on the way into Shabbos. And you have to say, oh, I would have liked to be there, but to let go of it. It's okay. I would have liked to be there, but I'm not going there because it's not what God wants. And it's not what I want, because I want what God wants. If God wants Shabbat, I want Shabbat. Okay, it would have been nice if they would have made it at a different time, but they didn't. So letting go of it and making God's will your will is referring to a greater challenge of molding our character so that it reflects and expresses God's will, even in situations where God's command is not specific. So the work of molding our character is a more complete expression of our potential for free choice. We could become who we truly are in our own unique potential, our inner potential, so we can work on ourselves to become who we could really be. Now, when a commandment has been given, even though a person has the option to do it or not do it, the fact that God has given the command encourages us to do it, because every Jew has a natural desire to serve God. So when we know what God wants us to do, we want to do it. Like a friend who says, I would love a cup of tea, and they bring you a cup of tea, and you really appreciate it. And that person wants to do it for you because they want to make you happy. They want to do something for you. So when we get the commandment, it's easier to do. And when somebody doesn't ask for the cup of tea and you bring it, it's even greater, because it's showing that you have that sense of, this is something that I know the person likes. So when the commandment is given by God, the choice is clear. God wants me to do this, period. And so we want to do it for God. But when God has not given us an explicit commandment, and a person has to elevate himself and refine himself until he relates to God's intentions for the world and appreciates what's expected of him, that challenge and the choice are far more inclusive. Because how do I get in there to know what God wants? How do I get in there to behave in the way that God wants me to behave? Now, this new approach to divine service, meaning having this freedom, represents a new dimension that's shown in this week's Torah reading. This reading begins, Shelach lecha. You may send. Doesn't mean you may send. You don't have to send. You could send. If you choose to send, then send. Rashi explains that the people had come to Moses with a request that spies be sent to explore the land of Israel, and that Moses had brought their request up to God. And God said something new that he hadn't said before. It's up to you. I'm not commanding you. If you desire, send. In other words, this was a new phase in our people's relationship with God. Not you have to do it, not you can't do it, but it's up to you. That's a completely new relationship. So here we are in this Parsha. And what does that mean? So until then, Moses was involved in commandments. Everything was, this is what you need to do. But the Torah also told of times when Moses asked God on behalf of the people, like the time when some people missed the time to offer the Paschal lamb. But even there, God responded with a specific command. Yes, this works on this day. Do it for these people can do it on this day. So this is the first time in the Torah so far, in this Parsha, when God leaves the choice to Moses. This was a completely new approach to divine service, that the initiative would be given to the people. So you have to understand that everything that is going on in the Torah is also applying to us, that we need to make the decision when we have that opportunity. And that's what God wants from us. Some people use the expression co-creators, that God is the creator and we are here to create along with God. And what that means is that we have to ask ourselves, how does that do that? How can we become a co-creator? So in this particular Parsha, this is associated with the objective of the spies' mission of our people's entry into the land of Israel. Now, the goal of life in the land of Israel is to make a dwelling place for God within the realities of everyday existence, not just up there in the heavens, but here where we are living. And wherever we are, that is something that God wants from us, to make this world a place of godliness. Specifically, this dwelling and the consciousness that goes with it should be made through the people's initiative. So God wanted that we come into the world to make this a godly place through our own initiative, that we are co-creating, that God made the world, and all there is God. That's the truth. But we need to make this place a world where this is known, that all there is God, and that we choose this of our own initiative. This is something that we have to want. So as we were saying, sometimes we have to bring ourselves to this way where we're not just saying, well, I want, like the child. But I wanted that cookie. Why don't you give me that cookie? What do you mean I have to wait for that cookie? What do you mean I have to eat supper first? That is where a child's, I want what I want. And the parent sometimes has to say, we eat real food first, and then we have the cookie. And that is part of the education that makes the person start to realize that they have to change themselves so that their own what they want becomes developed. Then they come home at a certain point, ideally, and especially if they've developed this, and they eat the real food first, and then they have the cookie. Or then they say, the truth is, I'm not even hungry for the cookie. I don't need a cookie, or whatever they decide. But we see that this is work, the work that people have to do. And this is through our own initiative and developing our recognition of what God wants so that we could be who God wants us to be. Now, if the dwelling, making this place a place where God is known, we're going to be established by godly revelation from above, which is what happened at Mount Sinai. God came down on the mountain and revealed himself. It wouldn't be complete. It wouldn't be complete. We would get it, but it has to be integrated to come from us. Everything that we receive needs to be integrated to come from us. Now, that would be God's accomplishment if he gave that to us and we just said, I get it, okay. That would not be what really God wants. God wants us to integrate this and for us to want what God wants. That God wants that the people in the world need to be part of the choice of making the world a place of divinity, a place where God is known. He wants us to want it. Now, when a person transforms his own will and goes through an inner metamorphosis, because this has to happen, in other words, to stop just saying, I want what I want, and move to I want what God wants, and to become that person, this brings us, it was something we have to picture. What does God want in this moment? Sometimes it's very helpful to take a moment of quiet and say, what does God want in this moment? An opportunity comes up, a situation comes up, and we have to see what to do. And sometimes it's good to take a moment before we answer or before we decide. And then we're able to choose according to what does God want at this moment. And we recognize, of course, what I want at this moment, but to align them so that becomes who I become. And then there becomes an inner metamorphosis. Then the person can go forward and transform his surroundings. And then God comes to dwell and be known in our existence. So this is where we have to work on this desire to connect to God, to use the gifts of who we are to serve God. And my teacher of blessed memory, who was a big tzaddik, Rav Gedalia Koenig, I tell the story sometimes because I loved him so much and I learned so much. And I learned from this story too. I heard him learning Gemara, where he was sitting in Svas had a low window, and I walked past the street and I could hear him learning Gemara. And he had what's called a Gemara niggin, the melody with which he spoke or sang his Gemara learning, his Talmud learning. And then I met him on the way to the bus. I was also going to the bus. And I asked him, did you learn this Gemara niggin from someone? Or did you come to it yourself? And he said, yes. Now, yes means both. That in his case, he heard the Gemara niggin that resonated with him. And when he started to work with that niggin, it became his own. But it also may have changed to some degree because it really came from his inner self. And that became his own. So there's a balance between who we are and what we learn, and also how we utilize it in the way that is appropriate for our being in the world. Now, in this Parsha, the focus is on human initiative. It's the first time that this happened. And the problem with this is we could make a mistake, as actually happened in this Parsha. Because if we have the choice to do what we want, we could make a mistake. So, and that's known. That's something that God is trusting us. He's giving it to us to make our own choice. And yes, it can happen that sometimes we don't do it quite the way that God would have liked. But in developing who we are and developing what God wants us to be, we can really grow to become the best that we could be. But nobody is perfect. Only God is perfect. So we're not perfect. So we have to know that. And in our Torah reading, the wrong choice was actually made when the spies returned. There were 12 tribes. Each one had a representative. 10 of them, the 12 all went. And 10 out of the 12 came back and spread panic among the people. making them afraid to go into the land of Israel. Now, the truth is that our decision-making very often has to do with what we want. Are we able to transform ourselves so that what we want becomes that we want what God wants? And two of the spies, Yoshua and Caleb, knew that God wanted the people to go to the land of Israel. And he knew that this was meant to be, and that that's what God wanted. So they went with that openness to say, if this is what God wants, this is what I want. And I'm going to go and I'm going to see it for what it is. And I'm going to look at it with a good eye. I'm going to look at it to see the good, because this is where God is bringing us, because this is what God wants. 10 of the spies were afraid to make changes. They lived in the desert where they lived on manna, and it was, they lived in the clouds of glory, where, their clothes were constantly cleaned by the clouds. Everything was in a certain way taken care of for them. And they were afraid to make the changes. They were afraid they wanted to stay in the desert where God took care of them in every way. And their teacher, Moses, continually taught them. They wanted this to continue, to live in their spiritual heavenly environment. In addition, they were afraid to get too deeply into the material world. They didn't know how God could be with them in everyday life. So their fears, they projected their fears forward and said, I don't want to do this because I'm afraid. But they didn't say, I'm afraid, because if they would have said, I'm afraid, they could have had a conversation with themselves that we're going to go into. But instead, they just projected out onto the future and said, no, I don't want that. I don't like it. We'll look at the land. This is not good. And they did not look with a good eye because they didn't want to see the good. Even though God made it clear that the people were intended to go to Israel, the spies took too much initiative. But by not only collecting information about the best way to enter the land, but also they thought that their job was to decide whether or not to enter the land. And that was a big mistake, because they left out what they knew God wanted. In other words, they could have and should have been looking at, what does God want me to do right now? They were meant to be supportive of God's decision to bring them forward into the land, to say, how can I do this? Not if. Not, well, I'm not sure if I want to do that. No. They were supposed to say, this is what God wants, and this is what we're going to do. How can we do it in the best way? So it's very interesting that this how helps us to grow in a way that we say, I know that this is what God wants me to do. How does he want me to do it? How does God want me to do it? Or I know that I'm going to have this opportunity. How can I do it in the best way? Not be, well, I don't know if I want to do this. I don't know if I'm really ready for this. But if it's something that is in the plan and you are going to be doing it, instead of complaining about, I don't know if I want to do it. I know I'm doing it anyway, but I don't know if I want to do it. Instead of that complaining, to say, this is something that I need to do. There is an obligation here, and I am going, and it's correct for me to go. How can I do it in the best way? What is the best plan? So the decisions that we make come from how we see ourselves. The spies saw themselves as powerless, so their lost self-respect became their projected weakness. Very important not to see ourselves as powerless. We have to know that God runs the world and that we can use our free choice to bring out the best in any situation. So how can we have the courage to go forward? Now, to go forward in life altogether, all of us, each of us, the spies, but also us, if they had trusted that God wanted the people to go to the promised land, they would have wanted what God wanted and gone forward. They could have taken initiative knowing that God was with them. Then they could have recognized their inner power and lived with their spiritual strength. They would have been able to conquer the land because God would assist them. That's something we have to know, that when we go forward to do what we're here to do, and if it's something that is good, then we have to have trust that God is backing us up and we will be able to succeed. This is something that we have to work with. And if they would have known this, they would have been able to conquer the land because God would assist them. And if they had known this, it didn't matter how powerful their enemies were, because God has a method. Knowing that they had an inner godly soul that we all have, they could have focused their vision on the promises that God had made and look at the situation from God's perspective. From an overview, what is it that God wants here? What is God's perspective for this time? When I'm going to travel to this place, how would God like this to look? What is my creative option in this situation to make this happen, to make it work? What could I do? So to come from this higher perspective, higher than, well, I don't know if I feel like going, I don't know if it's what I really want to do, but to come from a higher place and say, this is what God wants, I am going. What would God like here? What would God like from me? Then we can really grow. So I'm just going to quote a little quote from a letter that the Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote. And the Rebbe says, in general, one should always remember that should remember the saying of our sages, and the quote is, according to the camel is his load. What that means on a very simple level is that, I guess this was something that people had camels in, and you would put your belongings on the camel, instead of in the taxi. But if it was a big camel, you could give it a big load. And if it was a younger camel that was weaker still, then you would give it a lesser load. So you would figure out what camel would get which load. So the Rebbe was saying, according to the camel is his load, meaning that everyone is given the necessary inner strength to overcome the inner battle against temptation. And if you will only use your spiritual resources with the appropriate determination and not get discouraged by an occasional relapse, you will eventually come out victorious. So here the Rebbe is saying, do your work, fight your inner fight. I know I want, I don't want. Okay, fine. Sometimes it's right to say, I don't want to do this because it seems really not right to do it, so then don't do it. But sometimes it's something that God really does want you to do. And then we have to fight that inner battle and use our spiritual resources and have determination. But sometimes we make a mistake. That is part of free will. I'm not talking about somebody saying, well, this is not going to count, so I'll take, it's like somebody having, God forbid, a sick day, Okay, I'm going to take this day to do the wrong thing. It's not like that. We're always on duty to do our part. But if somebody makes a mistake and doesn't do it in the right way occasionally, not because we're not trying to do it right, then what happens is, okay, don't let that pull you down, because the evil inclination, or however you want to call it, the animal soul just wants what it wants. And sometimes we could make that mistake, but we can't let ourselves be discouraged, because then we we don't want to give up. God doesn't want us to give up. And if we say, okay, so that wasn't perfect, but you know what? I learned from that. Or it wasn't perfect, but I see that I can do this better next time. I will do it better next time. Then we do come out victorious. So this is part of our work, to use our free will, and also especially to understand that we are being given inner strength to do this, and that we have spiritual resources, and we have to have the determination to go forward, to do what we're in the world to do. So it's easy to remember that God is here. It's easier when we're following God's commandments because God's telling us what to do. So that's easier. I know what you want me to do. Got it. But knowing that in this time, there's no specific guidance, and we need to work on knowing that there's one God and that we live in the presence of the one, we are being given the opportunity to create. God is creating the world, and we can also create our space where we are and the places where we can affect other people. Now, when a person makes a mistake, the error could be corrected through tshuva, which is a sincere return to God. In a moment, what happens is the person will realize, oh, that's not what God wanted. I realize that's not even what I really wanted. And how did I do that? Oh, yeah, that wasn't good. And then we want to reconnect to God. And this desire to reconnect is also based on a person's initiative. That I could say, I'm not happy I did that. Like sometimes we need to say, I'm sorry to somebody when we did something that was hurtful to them, or we said something that really hurt them. It was even more than what we meant to say. And sometimes we have to say, I'm sorry, the way I said this I didn't mean it to be hurtful to you. And to find our way to say what I really meant was, but the person has to have the initiative to say, I really want to connect to you, and to say, I really want to connect to God. And this is done through tshuva, which is return. And that requires that the person should go into our own inner strength in order to reestablish the bond with God that has been broken through the lack of connection and then doing the incorrect behavior. Like when we hurt somebody's feelings, we have to go, oh, I think I did something I shouldn't have done. And so, little kid, sorry. That's little kids do that because they learned that they should say, I'm sorry. But it doesn't work very well to remake the connection, because when they say sorry like that, it means they don't really care and they don't really feel sorry and they haven't grown and nothing comes from it. But when a person says, I really want true connection with God, I want connection with God. I mean, the truth is we have connection with God, but we have to want to be aware of connection, and our free choice. We want to have to choose what makes connection. So when we're digging deeper into ourselves, we come to that place where we say, what do I really want? Do I want to do whatever I feel like doing whenever I feel like doing it? Or do I really want to connect with God and become who I really could be? So this is the work that when a person is doing this work to do tshuva, they could go beyond their earlier level of divine service. So, for example, when they're saying to their friend whose feelings they hurt, I'm really sorry. I really care about you. I really love you. What I wanted to say was this, but the way it came out was so harsh, and I don't want you to feel like I'm really angry at you or that I don't care about you, because that's not true. I really, really do. When the person hears that, what can happen is that their relationship becomes deeper, because we're coming from a place that's really inside. So sometimes, even though a mistake was made, it can come to a deeper relationship, coming from a deeper place. Now, the sages teach perfectly righteous people, tzaddikim, cannot stand in the place of a bal tshuva, a person who does this tshuva. Because when a person reaches deeper into themselves, they come from a place that is deeper than anything they've done yet. Now, it's also possible to do tshuva even without sin. So what happens if you didn't make a mistake? You didn't do anything wrong. The sages say that Mashiach will motivate the righteous to turn to God in tshuva. They didn't do anything wrong. Well, what's the tshuva? When a person wants to connect from a deeper place, then his newfound connection to God could be accomplished without an earlier descent. You don't have to go down to do that. You can say, I really, really, really want to connect to God more than I ever did before. And this is the purpose of an individual's power, to make a choice, to set out on his own initiative, accomplish his objective, and turn to God with the inner bond that is established through tshuva. So we have to have our free will, our own initiative, and keep working with that until we get deeper and deeper connection to God, and that we become deeper and deeper, and we become transformed through this work of using our own initiative in a good way. Now, the name of the Torah reading, Shelach, means to send. And this is indicating that every person in the larger sense, the Jewish people as a whole, is sent out, caused to leave their natural environment, and given a mission. And the mission enables both the individual and the nation to get to a higher rung. Now, in a personal sense, this means it's talking about the mission of every soul as it's sent down from the spiritual realms to be enclosed within the material body. This is a descent for the sake of an ascent. By using material entities for spiritual purposes, so you take a cup of tea, and the cup is used for something that's good and meaningful. The tea is used for something good and meaningful, that we're here to do our service and use something material. The soul, when it's used, when the person uses it for something that is spiritual, something higher, the soul progresses to a higher level than that from which it started. So the soul, which originally came down, comes from a higher place. But also we use the material world and make it come from a higher place, to a higher place. So we're bringing down what we get from God, and we're bringing up what's in the world to use it in a godly way. So in a larger sense, this is referring to the mission of the Jewish people to make our world a dwelling fit for God. We know our history. We have been sent out from continent to continent, working on our purpose for thousands of years, as it has been adding spiritual energy and content to the world through the observance of Torah and mitzvahs. So we are doing mitzvahs, learning Torah, doing mitzvahs. We make the world a higher place. We spread out the energy that is the godly energy. In the challenge to enter the land of Israel, a world that seems challenging, we have to realize that we have the inner strength to prevail, because we stand for more than ourselves. We're coming, we have souls, we're coming from something higher. We're here to represent what God wants. And we're given this mission to make this world a dwelling for God. And we have to know that there is nothing that can stand in the way of the fulfillment of this mission, because God doesn't make mistakes. So this is the mission. We're given a mission to make this world a dwelling for God, and that's what it's going to be. And we can participate in this for our free will. Now we're on the threshold of redemption, just before the coming of Mashiach. We're already in this process. And then we will commit the complete fulfillment of the promise of our Torah reading. I will bring them there, and they will know the land. That we will live in this godly way that God wants for us, and may this take place in the immediate future. So God is guiding us, and we have to trust that we have the ability to use our initiative to go forward, not to get scared. Can I really do this? When you know something is right for you and good for you, not to get scared, just to say, I know that this is something that God wants. I know that this is something that I can do. So may this be in the immediate future. And also, may we have the courage and the strength to go forward, to use our initiative to become who we are really meant to be. And whatever we do, we should do it with joy.